No, on the night of Jesus' passion, he goes to Gethsemane to pray. Luke chapter 22, verse 42 talks about Jesus' prayer, and at a point he prays that, Father, if it is your will, take this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. Anytime I read this scripture, I begin to think that Jesus was having a second, thought. Was this so?
The story of man is told in two gardens, the Garden of Eden, the Garden of Gethsemane. The Garden of Eden is Adam, who chose his own will against the will of God and did what was wrong and got expelled from Eden. The Garden of Gethsemane is where Christ, sort of also in a garden, in the same position as Adam, having to decide whether to choose his will, as Adam did, or to choose the will of God. And so all of that was very important to the redemption story. Jesus had to stand where Adam stood on behalf of mankind to sin for him to do the right thing. So was he in a double mind? There is something called the humanity of Christ and the divinity of Christ. Christ as a human and Christ as God. And when he lived on earth, he lived largely as a human. And his humanity, he stood where we stand. He became like us, having to choose between what is right and what is the will of God. What is comfortable and what is uncomfortable. And we all go through that when the will of God is so painful that you want something else. You want something that doesn't cost you so much. And in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus answered that question not only for himself, but for all of us. Our faith, therefore, is not in our ability just to obey God by ourselves, but we trust in his obedience as acceptable before God. That doesn't mean we can live our lives haphazardly, but the grace we have before God is because Christ stood where we stood, confounded because of the conflict of a decision he has to make, the pain of what he had to choose, and still chose the will of God. And when we trust him for salvation, that is what we are saying. We are saying, Father, not my own will, but yours be done. As Christ was, so are we. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he's representing the human race in our conflict of choice between God's will and our own pleasure or our own desires.